Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, Libya. Rich in oil, but what does that count for if you're headed for bankruptcy? The Prime Minister's been forced from office. Militias are running parts of the country. Who's really in control of Libya's most prized assets? Also this week, the tea plantation workers who say they've been coerced into share ownership. Was it a case of some of India's poorest being told to buy into the company they work for or to lose their job? And an oasis powered by the sun. We're in Senegal, where an arid land has been turned into a fertile one. So the newsline was that an oil tanker loaded with black gold from a rebel-held terminal had escaped from the Libyan Navy. On the face of it, an embarrassment to the government, but really it symbolised so much more. Because Libya is a country with the 9th largest proven oil reserves in the world. It has a population of 6.5 million people. It should be a wildly prosperous nation, but it's not. We're now well over 2 years since Muammar Gaddafi's regime fell, and militias have seized control of Libya's oil production facilities from a seemingly helpless government. In fact, Libya's Prime Minister fled the country despite a travel ban after being voted out of office by Parliament. Ali Zadan lost a confidence vote after that incident with the oil tanker, which was sailing under the North Korean flag. He's also accused of embezzlement of public funds. But Libya's problems go deeper than just one man, even if he was the Prime Minister. Revenue Watch, a New York-based think tank, actually thinks Libya's heading towards bankruptcy. Why? Well, the big problem is oil output. It's fallen to 230,000 barrels a day. Before the revolution, it was more like 1.6 million barrels. That's a huge drop when you consider Libya's oil and gas provides 90% of state revenue. That meant in 2013 oil income of around $48.7 billion. But then look at the outgoings. No use bringing in $48 billion if you're spending $54.3 billion. Now, yes, most countries do run a budget deficit, but not all countries, let's face it, have a dysfunctional government and militias trying to tear the place apart. What's more interesting, though, economically, is when you look at how and where all that money is being spent. There's a formal workforce of 1.9 million people in Libya. The government pays the salaries of more than half of them, so that's $16 billion there. There's also a provision for families, $80 per child and $95 per wife per month. It also pays between $400 and $2,300 a month to registered veterans of the revolution, and there's more than 200,000 of those, plus subsidies of $15 billion a year for fuel and food. And because fuel is subsidised, it's then being smuggled to places in North Africa and Europe. A generous government or a mismanaged economy? Maybe a little of both. But the most important factor in anything to do with the Libyan economy is the oil. Have a look at this from John Hendren, who went to the oil port of Zawiya to see what was really happening there.
Libya's lifeblood is pouring at a trickle. Oil wealth doesn't just drive the cars on Libyan roadways and the ships at Tripoli's ports, it fuels everything. From the craftsmen in the souks to Libya's fragile government itself, nearly entirely funded by oil revenues and now in the red. For 6 months, armed groups have blockaded the nation's major oil ports, demanding autonomy for eastern Libya, higher salaries for oil workers, and accusing the national oil company of corruption.
If the military were to go in and secure those compounds and there was fighting, could be a disaster.
Yeah, could be a disaster. Well, this is what we should, as a government, we should try to avoid it.
The blockades have sent oil production plunging from 1.4 million barrels a day last year to 230,000 barrels a day now.
Because Muammar Gaddafi controlled the main source of wealth here for so long, no one really knows what impact oil revenues could have on the daily lives of Libyans. And they never will until oil production sites like this one all around the country are at full capacity.
Extreme population-wise, talking about from 5 to 6 million, and annual income from oil and gas not less than 40 billion US dollars a year. So you can do a lot to have a good life to the Libyan people.
Libya's government leaders warned in August they would not be patient for long.
The government finds itself in a dilemma whether to use force and spill blood, which is very dangerous, or just negotiate with those who are doing this. And so far, negotiation seems to be the norm. And the fear is that if you start the shooting, you may not be able to stop it.
So 6 months into the oil blockade, there is still no resolution.
Are you frustrated?
You can say that. Yeah.
With a near standstill of oil production, the government has voted to raise the salaries of striking oil workers who've joined the blockade. But it can't afford to pay the raise.
So oil, cash flow problems, militias as well. There's a lot to talk about in Libya. We're going to do that with Oliver Coleman, Senior Middle East North Africa Analyst at the risk analysis group Maplecroft. He's joining us from Bristol in the UK. We thank you for your time. Can I be very broad to start with, Oliver, and just suggest that oil is perhaps Libya's curse? As it can be for many other countries, of course, but we're talking specifically about Libya here. Does it prove to be more of a problem than anything else?
Well, at the moment it certainly is. I wouldn't say that oil in itself is a curse for Libya. It could be a great boon for the country, but at the moment certainly, with a lack of state authority, with various factions running around and militias, oil is the only prize worth having in Libya. And as a result, any conflict, any disputes are naturally going to centre around oil. So at the moment, without any central control, without any state authority, oil really is turning out to be something of a curse for Libya at the moment, yes.
You mentioned the militia, so why don't we talk about that? What can you tell me? Who is actually buying the oil from them?
I don't think it's really clear at the moment who's buying oil from the Eastern secessionists, but I think it's important to remember really that these groups it's a wide spectrum of groups operating across the country with various ideologies, various memberships. It is not easy to pin down exactly what they're after. Even in the east, Jadran's brigades, the people who are actually controlling the 3 ports in the east of the country, are not necessarily a coherent ideological group. They do not necessarily have an agenda that they can push with the central government either. It really is a matter of a combination of familial, tribe, regional ties that are driving these groups, and essentially access to power and access to money.
And dare I say, Oliver, trying to get any semblance of control over these sorts of splintered groups, that would be a huge issue. Could any Libyan force unite them in any sort of way, do you think?
Well, I don't believe so, not at the moment. Certainly the central government doesn't have the authority or the institutions to sort of wrest control from these groups. Really, Libya is caught in a sort of catch-22 where the government relies upon the militia to enforce security across the country because the army is so weak. But at the same time, the militia are really the primary source of insecurity for the government as well. It's interesting that the government is actually relying upon these militia rather than the army to do this. It's indicative of the problem that they have in the country, that they must rely on these militia to enforce security, and it also indicates really that the militia have greater resources at their disposal than the army. So this is going to be an ongoing problem, and it's very hard to see how the government can integrate them into the security forces without really bolstering the support of local, essentially warlords, these militia leaders.
Let's broaden things out a little, Oliver. Oil, which is ostensibly where this story begins. Oil means money. Money should mean investment in a country. Is that happening in Libya, or are we still too much in this sort of post-revolutionary phase where things like, infrastructure, schools, those sorts of things perhaps end up getting overlooked a little bit?
We have seen a little bit of a boom in retail and some construction in recent months, but really this is down to a huge expansion of public sector wages. The government are trying to sort of offset potential socioeconomic unrest by giving public jobs, very classic tactic in the Middle East. But really, there is little scope for diversification, little scope for serious private-public partnership investments that could expand employment and really aid the economy. It was interesting that in January, the deputy head of the Libyan Central Bank, said that in every dollar they were getting for their oil, 0.77% of that was going, 77% of that was going to pay wages and not on development spending. So it's very hard to see how any government-led diversification could happen. At the same time, even the oil companies are are thinking twice about getting involved in Libya, despite the fact that it's a very good market for them. There's a lot of sort of underexplored regions, and it's good quality crude as well. The BP we saw recently announced that they were thinking of pulling out of suspending their operations on their onshore concessions out of concern for the security situation. So, without the oil revenues coming in, there is really little chance that the economy can be propped up, that the economy can recover, and that the country can be rebuilt. So unfortunately, we're going to see a continuation of socio-economic unrest as well, which is essentially, in the beginning, what gave rise to the problems in the East we see at the moment.
This is exactly the point I was going to raise, Oliver, because you mentioned those sort of cosmetic changes which were made with salary increases. I wondered if the underlying unemployment problems were still there, because this was the problem everywhere, wasn't it?
The government has managed to employ a large amount of people in the militia. They get government salaries, and some of them actually sort of take several government salaries from a militia, from being in the police, and also possibly in the army. But I mean, this is not a sustainable strategy. And the government, especially with oil revenues dwindling, and oil revenues account for about over 90% of Libya's government revenues. With that money going, they won't even be able to afford to pay the salaries that they've increased already. So it's looking quite bleak, I must say, and public services are also going to suffer. They already are suffering tremendously across the country, and the areas that were particularly neglected by Gaddafi remain, like the east, like Benghazi, for example, remain underdeveloped in comparison to the rest of the country, and neglected. Obviously, that was made worse by the conflict. But I think, ultimately, there is no real coherent plan for the government to develop the regions, develop the different areas equitably, and bring serious diversification, economic diversification, and jobs. Yesterday, the Parliament passed a regional development initiative without actually deciding previously what the regions were. So this is indicative of this haphazard approach to governance that they have at the moment, and economic governance in particular.
That's Oliver Coleman talking Libya with us this week. Oliver, we thank you very much indeed for your time. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, from destroyer to protector, how the sun in Senegal is coming to the rescue of farmers in the desert. We want to look at financing now because, and this is kind of stating the obvious, but the North Atlantic financial crisis really did reshape how people get hold of money for their business needs. In short, regulators are exerting more pressure and putting tougher rules in place, rules that mean banks must keep more cash in reserve to protect themselves from economic shocks. That, however, has meant less money being lent out to businesses, which in turn means less going into creating those much-needed jobs. So, is there another way? Of course there is. There's always an alternative, isn't there? In this case, it's actually called alternative finance. Our guest is the chairman and founder of one such financier, Dubai-based Falcon Group. It's Kamal Al-Zarko who's joining us from London this week. Short story, first of all, Kamal. If someone met you and asked, what is it exactly you do? How would you explain that in the simplest terms? I just want to sort of, a précis of that for our viewers.
Well, Falcon is an alternative lender. We provide lending to corporates around the world, and mainly on emergent markets and trade finance. We've been doing that for about 20 years, and we are increasing our presence globally. And
again, I'm just getting through the really simple stuff here. First of all, where do you get your money from? Just explain that for us.
Well, we raise money on the markets like everybody else. We have bilateral lines with banks on capital markets, and there's a lot of institutional investors as well who are looking to put money to work, not going through the banking system. And they can funnel this money through us because of our expertise and because of the balance sheet we have and the presence on the ground. And it's a win-win situation for the investors, for us, and for the corporate and the SMEs we deal with.
What I want to talk to you more about now is this idea, as you say, of alternative financing. The fact that since 2008, let's face it, people have found it a lot more difficult to get hold of money for their financial and their business needs. Now, I want to get some examples from you of what sort of business you've seen come through and how successful it's been.
Well, as I said, I mean, the alternative lending thing, we've been doing this for about 20 years. It's not something new for us. It's just becoming a much more fashionable industry in the last few years since the financial crisis. A lot of the banks have retreated, as we all know, and trade has been continued to grow. I think it's reaching about $20 trillion this year, and this has created a vacuum in between for funding for corporates and for trade finance. And this has to be filled in a way, and alternative lending is a way of doing this. Some of the local regional banks are stepping up to the task, and they are filling part of that gap. But as I said, it's a $20 trillion market, and it has to come from somewhere. I'll just give you one number, which is very significant. In the US in 2013, 27% of the lending for SMEs came from alternative lender, from non-banking institution. It tells you that it's a very, very deep trend, and it's here to stay for a long time.
So tell me about then, and obviously I don't want to step on any sort of client confidentiality issues here, but give me an example, if you can, of someone who's come to you with something really interesting and you've thought, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. I want to help them out with that. You know, what sort of things do people come to you with?
If I had to give you a very, very simplistic example, it's banks mainly consider companies and SMEs and corporates based on their balance sheet. And typically, clients will come to us because they're a smaller company or because they have their balance sheet that has been degraded because of the financial crisis. They've been through rough times, and they have a big book order. They have a buyer who's giving them a big order for, and it's a good buy usually, but they can't get the borrowing to get things going, to buy the raw materials, to process the goods, and to sell it to this buyer. And we would have a much more entrepreneurial approach to the transaction. We would consider the transaction on its own merits, rather than on the balance sheet, the way that most of the banks will look at those transactions. And we will take comfort from the order we would have from a major buyer, and we will help the company to get their hands on the raw material, to process those goods, and to deliver those to the final client, which we will secure our payments from directly, rather than from the company itself.
Regulation is what I want to ask you about as well. How heavily regulated are you? Because obviously the banks are very heavily regulated. You know, they have to have X amount in reserve in case things go wrong, as they did. How does it work for you, though? Are you regulated to that extent? What happens if you get in trouble? You're almost a middleman here.
We're not the middleman because we are using our own balance sheet, and we have quite a significant equity in the business that's near over $150 million today. So we do have a lot of skin in the game if and when things do go wrong. And when it comes to regulation, our activity is not a regulated activity for the time being, because we're mainly buying and selling and providing credit terms to our clients. But we chose to get regulated in Dubai, in the DIFC, by the DFSA, Dubai Financial Service Authority, even though we didn't have to. We've been bracing ourselves in the last few years for regulation to come, and I think it's not about a matter of if, it's about a matter of when the regulation will come. So we just took a preemptive step to get ourselves regulated, because eventually we think the regulation will come to the sector.
Kamal Al-Zawq is talking alternative finance with us on Counting the Cost Week. Great talking to you, Kamal. Thank you. Now, you've probably heard of the Indian conglomerate Tata. Steel, cars, chemical, tea as well, as it happens. And it's coming under criticism over its treatment of tea plantation workers in India. And when we say treatment, it's perhaps not what you might first expect. Faiz Jamil travelled to Assam to speak to workers living there on a tea plantation.
Arkit Naik and his wife have been living and working on this tea estate for more than a decade. About 5 years ago, Amalgamated Tea, owned by the Tata conglomerate, offered Naik and other employees a chance to buy company shares. Naik says he and others weren't interested, but weren't given a choice.
We were told, if you don't take shares, your work will be stopped. The laborers can't read or write. They were rounded up and forced to give their thumbprints. We were scared. That's why we gave in.
Even though he's now a part owner, Naik's family lives in a home without electricity and a roof that's been leaking for the past 8 years. They say any complaints about living conditions or share dividends are ignored.
Our house is in bad shape. I can't even take a $80 loan. How did they decide to take $130 from us? They forced us.
We tried speaking to other employees, but were asked to stop filming by several men on motorcycles who escorted us away. Amalgamated Tea declined an on-camera interview, but in person and through email stated that dividends have been paid yearly, though they were called something else in bank statements. They also say that any issue with worker conditions were isolated incidents. Al Jazeera later met several other Amalgamated Tea employees, who told us despite now being part owners of the company, they still live in poor conditions. They also had no idea they'd receive dividends, and that different company officials gave them different answers.
Tea plantations rely on a large number of workers to stay productive and profitable. Giving the workers company shares is being touted as a way to share the profits and improve their lives. But critics charge it's actually a way to shield the company.
This union leader says many workers believe now that they're shareholders, they've lost the right to complain about working conditions, and giving shares simply distracts from the conditions they endure.
After giving $130, the Tata Tea worker still has many problems. They don't have proper homes, water to drink, or hospital facility. What they need to get, they're not getting.
When contacted, Amalgamated Tea stated that the share scheme is entirely voluntary, and that they strongly refute that there was coercion or any sort of pressure whatsoever on employees to apply to this scheme, and that no employee has lost his or her job either for not subscribing to the share scheme or for voicing grievances. But workers we spoke to say they're too worried to complain and feel powerless to improve their lives or their future.
Finally, this week we head into the deserts of West Africa, where there is a very harsh reality. It's hot, really hot, which has always meant that growing crops was nigh on impossible. But here's a story about how the sun's rays are working for the farmers rather than against them. Nicholas Haak has that for us from Lampol in Senegal.
Growing tomatoes in the desert, surrounded by sand dunes, Lumpul village is an oasis powered by the sun. A 2,000-watt solar panel powers pumps that draw water from 100 meters underground. This once arid land is now fertile.
It's a miracle. We haven't seen any rainfall since October, and yet we have all the water we need. We're growing onions, tomatoes, all sorts of vegetables.
74% of Senegalese have no access to electricity. The state distributed the panels to 13 villages as part of a pilot project funded by international donors. Each one cost only $4,000 to install.
It is less costly now to organize some irrigation using solar energy than pumping of the water with some diesel engine.
As part of the Green Climate Fund, developed countries promised to raise $100 billion by 2020 to fund projects like this. Among international agencies, there's a growing eagerness to bring in new forms of technologies such as wind turbines and solar panels to Senegal and throughout West Africa. But the government here is cautious, and they're less enthusiastic about these new alternative form of energy. The government has just signed a $500 million contract to build coal-fired power plants.
At the moment, the state subsidizes energy. It's too costly. That's why we've invested in this power plant. It's a quick and easy way to get electricity and reduce costs.
But anti-corruption campaigners are not convinced. They accuse government officials of taking kickbacks and say energy from coal costs more than solar.
We want the government to make the contracts public. They need to clearly justify why they are investing in coal mines rather than in solar energy.
Solar power could pose a serious threat to the government's ability to make money from power. It challenges the state control of the distribution and cost of energy. The sun is reliable, free, clean, and available all year round. Investing in this green energy is giving power to the people who need it the most.
And there you go, that is our show for this week, but there is more for you online at aljazeera.com. You click through to the program's link. From there you'll find the Counting the Cost page with all our previous episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch. Twitter's the easiest way. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. There is our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, and don't forget to use the hashtag Counting the Cost as well. You can just drop us an email if you want. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.